Good evening and welcome to Greater Somerville for March 10th, 2015. I'm KyAnn Anderson. Tonight we will be taking an in-depth look into a topic on the minds of many, as the federal court trial of alleged Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev has recently begun. From the tragic deaths of Martin Richard, Lou Lindsay, and Crystal Campbell, the over 260 victims who suffered injuries, to the subsequent killing of Somerville's very own MIT officer, Sean Collier, it's hard to forget the horrors of April 15, 2013. And we recognize of the sensitivities this topic might bring up tonight in our discussion. However, I believe strongly that while these happenings forever impacted the lives of so many that day, a thorough understanding of the mind, culture, and background of the accused and others like him may help to identify behavioral patterns and characteristics of what led to the violent tragedies of that day. Tonight, we take an in-depth look into the psychological complexities that influence the potential for terrorist violence in children and how youths are being influenced and recruited for violence and terrorism around the world. We'll also explore whether or not we could develop a more effective way to identify these traits in teens and young men and women. Can we, as parents, teachers, pastors, imams, and social workers help terrorism experts in their investigations and in the process decrease the likelihood of future terrorist attacks? Our guest this evening is a clinical and research psychologist as well as an author from Cambridge, Massachusetts, with a specialization in working with adolescents and young adults around the issues of violence, oppression, trauma, and loss, as well as a researcher of terroristic behaviors. And she's here tonight to help us understand these topics and more. So please join me in welcoming for her debut appearance here on Greater Somerville, Dr. Alice LoCicero to the show.
Thank you very much for having me
to the
here.
show.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on this wonderfully spring day,
Yeah.
which was excellent. So as I said before, we're talking about something that's obviously pretty intense, but you are. Thank you for coming down. But so you recently published a book, Why Good Kids Turn into Deadly Terrorists, deconstructing the accused Boston Marathon bombers and others. And we should just note that there's some book signings that are coming up. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. And this is just one of those topics that's really, I mean, we'll find out a little bit about your background, but it's with everything going on in the world, I just appreciate being able to talk to you. So you are a native of Cambridge, Massachusetts, board-certified clinical psychologist, and a member of the core faculty at the Center for Multicultural Training in Psychology at Boston Medical Center.
Correct.
And you work with survivors, with family members of victims and trauma, mass disasters, and torture from 5 continents, as well as the past president of the Society for Terrorism Research, which is very impressive. So you've seen this firsthand. You did some significant research abroad into these types of issues. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, in 2007, after a great deal of preparation, I traveled to Sri Lanka during the civil war there and interviewed children at risk of recruitment to the Tamil Tigers, which has been the most notorious of the militia using terrorism as a separatist. It's now, the war's over there, but the war lasted 26 years.
Wow.
And they were a very vicious group. But I've talked with kids who were at risk of recruitment, some people who had family members in the Tamil Tigers, and so on, and really tried to understand the militia, the violence, the kids being recruited to being child soldiers from the perspective of the people I was talking with in that area. And I chose Sri Lanka on purpose because they had such a, sadly, a terrible record of recruiting kids, sometimes kidnapping kids, and forcing them to fight. And so it was important for that element. It was also important to me, KyAnn, to go to a place that was not representative of the Middle East, because I felt, and my colleagues felt, that there was so much emotionality about terrorism in Middle East countries, and so it was so difficult for people to be calm and rational in analyzing that, and we wanted to look at it from a different perspective, from a non-Muslim, non-Middle Eastern perspective.
So your research of this topic has gone back many years.
Yes, indeed.
You have two books. One of them is Creating Young Martyrs, and then this book, which is more topical to obviously those of us who live in this area.
Right.
So, you know, let's just get right into it, because there's so
Sure.
many things to talk about with little time. But what are some of the factors that contribute to kids joining organizations that use these terrorist tactics?
So I'd like to start by saying that many of the kids that I researched and learned as much as I could about were kids who had started out being rather good kids, not just ordinary kids, kids who were regarded by others, including adults and their peers, as being good kids. That actually seems to have made them a little bit more amenable to recruitment. That is, once they got into a vulnerable position and were faced with people trying to manipulate their thinking and causing them to question what was a good way to put forward a cause that they were particularly invested in. They really wanted to do right for their families, for their communities, and it became a question of what's right and what's wrong. But their intentions were often to help their cause, to help their people, so to speak.
Is there a clear pattern that you have researched in terms of, you know, is there a specific age group that when they're most susceptible, like as you're saying, vulnerable to wanting to do these types of things, or did you find a clear pattern of how they recruited these children?
Well, most of the people that, as we have seen in recent times, and most of the people that my colleagues and I have worked with have been and talked with have been adolescents. I think adolescence is in fact a fairly vulnerable time. There's a sort of a sense of idealism, a sense of responsibility for changing the world, that somehow their generation is going to be the one to fix things. And the sense of taking some of the perceptions that they have of grievances and of political issues, taking them very, very deeply seriously.
Okay. In your previous book, Michael Commons wrote, who wrote the foreword in that book, stated that there's a lack of understanding has a big impact on our policies towards terrorism and its prevention. So how would you characterize some of those misunderstandings?
Well, I think the chief misunderstanding that I've run across in talking with people has been the idea that people who engage in terrorism hate all Americans and hate our freedom and want to kill as many Americans or as many Westerners as possible. If we look at the research and scholarship on terrorism, one of the common sayings, I think it's attributed to a researcher named Brian Jenkins, is terrorists don't want a lot of people dead, they want a lot of people scared. And if we think about terrorist actions as a technique to destabilize a society, to make people extremely afraid and in fact somewhat hysterical and less able to think clearly. That would be an important thing to understand.
So in your book that dissects Dzhohar's experiences, life experiences and his behaviors, you mentioned something about code switching, which you referred to as a term that if you could elaborate on that, as well as switching as a cultural, linguistic, and psychological concept in general, as well as for Jahar.
Right, I think that's an important thing. I want to say here, though, that it's important for me to be clear that I don't think I or any of us have all the answers at this point, and dissect might be a little bit of a strong word. I did what I could to try to understand in depth using psychological theory and all the information that I had and have available. I think that there will be more information forthcoming over many years about kids who get recruited. But let's talk about code switching for a minute.
Okay.
Code switching is a term used for people who, generally for people who belong to two cultures, and typically you have two languages. And so what happens is, for many, and this happens for many kids, this isn't a thing that's associated, and adults, it's not something that's particularly associated with terrorism, except under certain circumstances. But so if you can imagine someone who is an immigrant and whose family perhaps speaks one language, but they're in school, they're speaking a different language, they're also immersed in a culture in their family and perhaps their immediate community that may be different from the general culture of the countries to which they have immigrated. And so there's kind of two sides to their lives.
Yeah.
The side that's the home side or the primary culture side, and the side that's the adopted culture side.
And so that can lead to a little confusion or confliction in terms of identity, in a way.
It kind of depends, you know.
Okay.
It can, but it especially can if the perception, and I'm not saying it's necessarily reality, but if the perception of the person is that the two cultures to which they belong are in conflict with one another, it becomes very difficult.
Okay. So getting back to Jahar, in terms of how, I believe that a reporter pondered that he was described as an affable but off-the-rails 20-year-old who smoked dope, failed in the classroom, and was easily led by an overbearing brother. What are your thoughts about that description?
Yes, my thoughts are that there are many ways to see any one person. You know, you could describe any of us in 5 or 6 or 7 different ways, and I think the reporter was asking, is this going to be the prevailing view of him, or is there some other view of him that's going to prevail in the end at the trial? But there are many different views, and I think we have to be really careful not to be too extreme in seeing any of them as being the whole person, whether we're talking about the accused and now admitted marathon bomber or anyone else.
Well, to that point, and getting back to the code switching idea, because he's from Chechnya and they're experiencing nearly 2 decades of violent and abusive government there. Did this influence his beliefs in any way? I mean, in your belief, if so?
I'd like to say it's really more like 2 centuries and even more of conflict, but in particular the last couple of decades have been extremely periods of intense conflict and just terrible violence, and we can read about that in any number of books and so on. But I think more to the point was that the family of the accused bombers had, in its personal, you know, in the family experience, there was also a lot of trauma. So there's the general background of war. Now, they did not live in Chechnya, but they
but they were from there and then they migrated.
Identified as ethnic Chechens. They actually, the boys actually grew up, I think, in Kyrgyzstan, and then in Dagestan for about a year or so, and then to the U.S. But they were.
Oh, go ahead.
But their father was, as far as we can tell, as far as I can tell from our reports, had been tortured because he was an ethnic Chechen, and that was, if I understand correctly, that was the grounds on which they were given asylum in the U.S. But remember, the brothers were quite young at the time that their father was tortured, and that certainly wasn't the only violence that their family had experienced over generations.
Because it was interesting, just based upon where Jahar was in terms of his young adult transition, which I think you mentioned in your book, in terms of how that time frame between when a young adult leaves high school and enters into college, their sense of identity tends to be challenged. And so do you think this could have affected
Well, I think more
Jahar?
to my point on that, you know, I live in Cambridge. I've been here for many years. Actually, wasn't born here, but I've been in Cambridge for many years. But I think that many of my neighbors and many of the people in Cambridge were asking, did we fail these young men? Did we do something wrong? We tried so hard, and we have good schools and good youth programs and so on. And my sense from all my research was that actually Cambridge did not fail the brothers any more than any other community might have, you know, made some omissions or so on, but that in fact Cambridge provided a great deal for them. But we do have to remember that the younger brother did leave Cambridge a couple of years before this event and went off to college. But it's not only that he left Cambridge. Leaving Cambridge, of course, was leaving a whole lot of supports, and that is a hard time for kids. It's also an exciting time and so on. But there were many family matters that occurred during that same time period that were very difficult. His father became ill and moved back to Dagestan. His parents divorced and his mother also left. His brother was gone for several months and then returned. There were increased financial difficulties and losses during that time period. So a lot of change was happening. I've often wondered if Jahar had been living in Cambridge at the time that these possibilities of engaging in this action came up, whether he would have had drawn different conclusions and had different kinds of supports to lead him in a different direction.
So, getting back to your comment about Cambridge community having that sense of responsibility, I think that's a really important one.
Yeah.
But I also question whether or not, if you think it's possible that Americans in general could comprehend these influence of generations of cultural trauma that you describe, given that so few people in our society have really ever experienced that level of violence and corruption so common in the other areas.
Yeah. You know, I think it depends on who your reference group is, KyAnn, because remember that I've chosen, it's the latter part of my career, and I've chosen to work with people in and out of the U.S. who are victims of oppression and so on. And so I think there would be a number of people in the U.S. who would question the idea that Americans don't understand. I think some Americans probably do understand.
Yes, absolutely.
To some degree. So I think, though, you know, your point is very well taken. How hard will it be for many Americans, for so-called mainstream Americans, to be able to grasp? And that's kind of part of what I'd like to do, is to help people really grasp what that is like. And I have worked, as you mentioned, with a number of refugees. So I've heard many, many very graphic and difficult stories from people who've been tortured and abused in other places, as well as people who've had very difficult lives here in the U.S.
So one of the questions that I'd like to at least tackle this episode is just trying to understand how these, you know, I understand that there's this terrorist identities data mart environment, or TIDE, is the current database used to identify potentially dangerous individuals who might be a threat to society. And my first question is, would you recommend that the U.S. or other countries try to identify the youth at risk that you research? So
I'd like to quote a Norwegian commentator on terrorism who said, you know, in the U.S., I'm probably not giving an exact quote here, I'm paraphrasing, let's say that. In the U.S., when kids seem to go astray, people demonize them or think that they're terrible and really, really worry about them. In Norway, if somebody goes astray, we try to bring them back to the mainstream. And I think that's very, very important for Americans to understand, that I would prefer that we not sort of identify. I'm worried about profiling. I'd like to, in fact, have a similar attitude to what the Norwegians say, so that maybe kids do go off the mainstream, and particularly they may have very off the mainstream ideas, and it would be great if there are a number of adults who are present to really help them to explore some of those ideas side by side with them and help them come back to the mainstream.
No, and I definitely would agree with that. I think there is obvious advantages to try and intercept these types of behaviors prior to you know, atrocities happening. So I by no means,
No, and well said that you say behaviors, because I think that's really important. Rather than targeting people, let's look at some of the things that make us worry.
But in terms of, so here's my question. Why do you, in your book, recommend that regular members of communities, parents, teachers, clergies, etc., try to establish the means to prevent, or at least reduce, the likelihood of youth from their communities being recruited to groups like terrorist tactics?
Because I think those are the people who are best suited for it. They know the kids personally. They're able to connect with the kids. I think it's going to be hard work for communities, because I think people who care about kids, and you mentioned a number of parents, teachers, coaches, etc., to really work hard at helping kids make good decisions, good critical thinking skills, developing those, but also helping kids exploring, because, you know, the political dimension is pretty important here. So when kids bring up political grievances, which many adolescents have, as you know, to really take that seriously and not to hush them, but to really explore with them, do the research, figure out, and help them to find ways to really act on the grievances, those grievances that turn out to be legitimate after exploration.
And after that exploration, say if a type of behavior is of an alarming kind of level, where does one, I mean, you know, at some point they can try to make the child go in one direction, but do you alert authority? I mean, the reason I'm asking this is because, you know, let's be honest, the CIA and the FBI have not been very successful at this. For example, you know, fall of 2011, CIA asked for his older brother and mother to be added to the terrorism database, but the FBI found no ties to terrorism. So, you know, that's the type of thing where here you have these government agencies that are supposed to be talking to one another, and yet, you know, we are, with the premise of your book, trying to understand more of the complexities of these children and their behaviors, and hopefully identify these things before they get to that level. So, you know, is that, I don't want to be cynical, but I just want to be realistic.
I think it's much more realistic. I think it's much more realistic for people who live in the community with kids to know them, to guide them, to take them seriously, to talk with them, to prevent rather than to try to identify or target. I think the prevention piece, that's where I would like us to put our efforts. And I think it's going to be hard work, but I think we can do it. So I think part of the problem, when we look at the CIA, the reason people tend to look at the CIA and FBI and the government and say, you do it, please help, is because of this fear, which in that sense I would say, you know, the people who have done terrorist actions have had some success because they have kind of made people hysterical. And so I think what we need to do is to really calm down and to recognize what the limits and the size, the real consequence and size of the risk are. I'm not trying to minimize at all the staggering impact of the Boston Marathon bombing. I don't want to, I'm not trying to do that, but I think we do need to not to try to be as rational as we can, to not be too scared and not to try to turn this over to other people, but to try to deal with it in our own communities.
So you further suggest that those who are close to the youth listen carefully, take their grievances seriously, and explore them honestly with youth. And so in this instance with Jahar, I mean, was there something that could have been done? I mean, I don't know. It's just, I think there's a lot of people out there that really just kind of they're watching the trial, they're going through the horrific acts of that day and trying to dissect or understand where that sort of hatred would come from. And so was that I mean, I don't know. I'm just wondering whether there was something that
Let me say that I think that my conclusion from what I read and what I looked at was that there were some subtle communications that might have been picked up on had people been a little more attuned to this. And that's part of why I think prevention can work, but I do think there has to be a great deal of attunement to kids. I think there were some possible moments when I don't fault people for not responding because we really didn't know. But I think now that we know, and now that we're more aware of these things, I think it's incumbent on all of us to really think hard and work together.
And listen.
And listen very hard. And then when we hear these things, be able to be engaged enough to help provide guidance for kids.
And then I've got my final question here. Terrorist actions and the motives behind them are sometimes incredibly complex. Was your goal with your research and book to simplify this complexity and or provide readers a means for understanding terrorist actions?
Yeah, I don't think, no matter how much I want to simplify it, I couldn't. It's just not simple, as you said. It's really complex. If anything, I would like to help people understand how complex it is and to be willing to grapple with those complexities and sometimes even things that may seem like contradictions. Because as I said, we're not quite there yet. We're making a lot of progress as researchers, but there's still a lot to go. There are several other researchers around the world who have very similar conclusions to mine. But again, none of us feels that we're completely finished with this work.
Yeah,
we have more to do. There's more to do.
It's a lofty goal, that is true.
Yeah, and it is complex.
And I wanted to just bring up before, we've got a couple of minutes here, you've got a couple events coming up
Sure
at the
do.
Cambridge Public Library,
Right.
Thursday, March
That's
12th
right.
at 6:30,
Yeah.
as well as the Somerville Central Library at 79 Highland, and that's Thursday, March 19th at 7 p.m.
Yeah.
So you can go
Yeah.
over and talk about some of the items that we talked about this evening.
Absolutely, and if people want to talk with me and other people who are concerned, those are two great venues. I also have a event at Nassau Community College on Monday the 16th at 11 a.m. for anybody who's watching who's in the Long Island area. And on the 20th, I have a signing at the Harvard Bookstore along with two other of my colleagues.
Very accessible online. All of the website and contact information will be on our blog tonight, our Greater Somerville blog, but you could go to www.whygoodkidsturnintodeadlyterrorists, all one word, .com. Also follow her on Twitter at Dr. A-L-O-C, or Dr. A. LoCicero.
Right, you got it.
So there you go.
Yeah.
Let me switch camera here. Oops, excuse me. So I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Alice LoCicero, for coming down to Greater Somerville tonight to share her professional expertise on the factors and psychology which may influence the minds of our youngest potential and actual terrorists. Her insights and research inform our ongoing discussion of how to move forward, a conversation no doubt occurring among many here in Somerville, Cambridge, and Boston as we watch the trial of accused Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. While the subject matter of tonight's program explores a topic that evokes tremendous pain and emotion for so many, the recent increase in exploitation of children within radical terrorist organizations demands a thorough investigation of these complex psychological factors, as these influences could be viewed as a potential catalyst behind the tragedies of that day. The importance in observing, identifying, and alerting authorities of these behaviors is a critical first step. With radical forms of terrorism becoming commonplace, society must do our part, regardless of emotional sensitivity, to understand the mindset of these culturally traumatized and potentially violent individuals, to help prevent more unthinkable terroristic acts as witnessed on April 15, 2013. May the community and the surviving victims and their families find peace in the upcoming weeks and years ahead as we continue to heal and remain Boston strong. For information on tonight's program and to find out more about Dr. LoCicero's work and upcoming events, please visit our blog at www.greatersomerville.wordpress.com. And that does it for us tonight. Thank you to the viewers at home for watching. Until next time, stay safe and stay informed.